So yeah, this is an idea that was born kind of to begin a lab that we did a year and a half ago at the RIDM. Sandra was the moderator at the time. We wanted to just invite some of the lead thinkers in the VR field that were involved in different areas of creation and of curation to really debate. So even though this is 9 a.m., we're kind of setting the stage as though we're kind of a couple drinks in at the bar and we're just like letting loose and actually saying our real, like this is where the truth comes out and we really can just kind of let our hair down and really get to the grit of what it is we're thinking about. And it's really interesting to do this 18 months after their original manifesto because a lot has changed, I think, in our relationship to VR in terms of our expectations around it. So we're just going to see what happens. What we're doing this time is actually we're kind of like franchising the anti-manifesto model. We're preparing a document here this morning in Montreal to take to Berlin because this is also part of the VRRV project, which has been happening upstairs at the Phi Center all week. We introduced the projects yesterday. We have the mentors here on the anti-manifesto this morning. And the document we prepare, we all take to Berlin, so 25 participants all travel to Berlin. There's half Germans, half Canadians. We're meeting there in 2 weeks, and we're going to redo the anti-manifesto with German participants at the Republika conference. So it's going to be really exciting. We have Karim Ben Khalifa. We have probably someone from Rimini Protocol. We have, who else is joining us? Anyway, it's going to be a really interesting constellation of people in Berlin as well. So just quickly, we have Anna Serrano, the Chief Digital Officer at the Canadian Film Centre, who is going to be our moderator. Liam Young is a speculative architect that you might have seen doing the keynote for MUTEK yesterday morning in this very room. He runs a future think tank called Tomorrow's Thoughts Today, and also a nomadic research studio called Unknown Fields. Thanks for being here, Liam. We have Annina Zwettler, who's one of the mentors on the VRRV, and also a commissioning editor for ARTE, the French-German broadcaster. She commissioned specifically VR projects, or she as well?
I'm doing everything.
Louis Richard Tremblay works with the National Film Board. The immersive, interactive studio. I should know better. Myriam Achard is the curator of the Phi Center. I actually don't even know your title. She's the one, she curated Particles of Existence that can be seen upstairs. I highly recommend on the second floor. And Sandra Rodriguez. All of these people do many things. Sandra Rodriguez is with the MIT Open Doc Lab, is teaching the first course on VR at MIT, and also is running the creative reality lab at the High Steel Film. So thanks for being here, guys.
Great.
All right, Anna, take it away.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is ready and awake because this hopefully will be a very heated, non-alcoholic, yet equally disruptive conversation.
No pressure.
Can we switch to the slides? So I think it's really important before we launch into this debate that we set the context, okay? And so the context that I'm going to set is really based around both grounding virtual reality in kind of its artistic legacies, or attach it to where it came from. And Canada plays a very important role in that. Contextualizing the present day of VR against sort of a socio-political, economic context that we live in, and sort of teasing out some threads. So we're going to start with that. So first and foremost, how many of you guys recognize this text, this monograph? Bioapparatus, okay? So this was a monograph developed, or a text based on a residency that Catherine Richards and Nell Tenhoff, both well-known Canadian artists, did as a part of one of the residencies that Michael Century did at the Banff Centre from 1991 to 1994, all around artists and virtual environments. And at this particular residency, they gathered all of these people, okay, who are really the first thinkers of what virtual reality art is supposed to be, to talk and discuss issues regarding the notion of embodiment in VR. So you have people like Shar Davies, David Rokeby, you have Norm White. I don't know if any of these names mean anything to you, but these are like significant artists, Canadian artists, who really understood and interrogated the relationship between the technology and the body. And all of this work was actually the work during those residencies from 1991 to 1995 was aggregated in this book called Immersed in Technology, and it was edited by Mary Ann Moser. And it's now available in Google Books for free. So there's all sorts of amazing essays in there from both Char Davies, Brenda Laurel, who's now resurfaced in many of the VR festivals and conferences today with her work that she did at Banff called Placeholder, and also work by Michael Neymark, who's now continuing the experiments he's doing with the VR filmmaking. So I would suggest that this is a place for all of us to start. You know, it's important that we kind of start to look at what was actually being done at that time. And if you just kind of give me a couple of seconds about what they were trying to do, this was, I'm going to read a little bit on their call for applications for this residency program, so a virtual seminar on the bioapparatus. And this is what they talked about, okay? So they said, virtual reality or virtual environment technology is of particular interest in the context of the bioapparatus. It is a symptom as well as an instrument of a reordering of perception, and one can anticipate of power relations. The current mythology surrounding the technology reconstitutes the mind-body opposition and raises issues of body materiality. As such, virtuality can be looked at as an expression of social discourses that are already in place. It goes on and on and on. It sounds obviously super academic, and today's talk is not going to be about that. But it's really important, but it's really important for us to kind of understand that some of the core issues that we as industrial creators of VR have been kind of discussed, unpacked, tested, prototyped, thought about, disputed, etc., for the past, I don't even know how long that was, over 20 years, right? So, situating VR as an artistic practice that has great roots in Canada is very, very important. So that's the art part. The socioeconomic context part is, if you look at 1991, right, so this was happening in 1991 to 1994, basically what was happening is that artists and technologists and creators, at that time not a lot of industrial creative industries people were jumping on the bandwagon, but they were really quite excited about the possibilities of the medium while interrogating it at the same time. So including myself. And I think for many of us, we really bought into the potential democratizing power of digital network technologies, of which VR is just one part, right? So we really bought in, we drank the Kool-Aid, we looked at the aesthetic stuff, we focused on issues of interaction and immersion, but I can't say for everyone, but certainly for me, I had a single failing. And my single failing was I got so immersed in actually thinking about art and aesthetics and the notion of making that I failed to really pay attention to how the core infrastructure was being built and how threads around society were starting to solidify that would impact how I actually thought about the form, how I thought about digital networked media. And so I think it's important for us to talk about what some of those threads are. Well, some of those threads are things like the environment, right? So now in the mainstream, we're very, very everyone is has a consensus that we are in crisis mode. Another one has to do with just recently got even more sort of accepted in mainstream society is the kind of the failure of the neoliberal system and how inequality is now again sort of something that we all kind of accept as the byproduct of a certain set of economic policies that people thought would work but really didn't. And then last but not least, that technology, now that we've been living with it for some time, actually does affect and affect social relations. So now we have enough research to understand how families can be fragmented, how social behaviors are changing and being disrupted. So there's all of these threads that are going on over the past 20, 25, 30 years that we're kind of wrapping this whole practice that we have around new media making. And for some who were really insightful and smart, they understood how that related to their work. For others, such as me, I wasn't as aware of how those kinds of larger trends could affect the work that I was doing. So now that VR is moving into the next evolution, I don't want to make the same mistake. And because most importantly, what's happened is that a lot of that stuff that has emerged is the solidifying of platform monopolies. So as people were making art, and as people were making content, and as people were building, getting funding from all sorts of agencies to make and produce content and work, the power structures were actually becoming more hardened, and the platforms through which our work was going to get distributed became monopolies. And that's a critical piece that we all need to now live with and figure out whether or not these same platform monopolies are going to get amplified as we move into this next computing revolution, of which VR is a part. And the other thing we need to understand is that even though we are now aware, or more aware, Moore's law is Moore's law and is irrefutable, it seems, right? So it's not just VR that we have to think about, or immersive media. It's really the integration and the convergence of a number of major computing shifts that are going to solidify into a single hard rock that's either going to hit us all on the head and kill us, or that we will have some control over, right? So it's like immersive media, it's AI, and all the attended sub kind of AI-like things, whether that's big data or machine learning, IoT, Internet of Things, ubiquitous computing, and then cybersecurity. So how do we, that's the question, how do we manage this fast-moving cycle of innovation, which may result in solidifying infrastructures with unintended consequences? So lest you think that all of this is so dire and what's the point, we might as well go grow a garden, there is another trend that's just starting to sprout. And it's really this sort of trend that's Michael Talon sort of coined, and he's calling this new generation the magic kids. So there is, amongst all of the sort of terrible political things happening in the world today, there does seem to be these like little sprouts of spring-like movements and hopeful movements coming up, sort of personified by Emma Gonzalez, of the teenager who was affected by the Florida shooting, and who, with her friends, decided to do something about it. So these are sort of not Gen X kids who kind of grew up without the internet and then grew up with the internet. These are digital natives. These are people who understand what it means to live with the technology, but somehow were able to figure out how to negotiate their relationship with technology in such a way that they are also very much embedded in physical communities and in change making. So this is the context we are in today. And what we need to do now is figure out, given this, well, this is my perception of the context we're in today, and given where we are now, how do we then situate VR? Do we care? Do we not care? Do we have a different way of looking about this? So what's next? So Liam. You're up first.
Right. Okay. I guess in the spirit of Manifesto, we're doing a word. Or do you want to do this word thing?
Do a word, and then
okay.
Your 2 minutes explaining your word.
All right. So we were each asked. VR is ... My VR is not the future. I guess in the spirit of the anti-manifesto, which is just to say that I've been on lots of VR panels and they all tend to turn into a discussion like you just started, I guess, which is a broader discussion around the cultures of technology, which is to say that I think I've never been on a panel that actually really talks about VR itself. I think part of that is because it's decidedly boring sometimes and really underwhelming for the most part. And as my word suggests, it's not the future. Unless you are big Ready Player One fans and you believe that we're all going to continue in this future of the stacks, run around with ski goggles strapped to our face, I just can see VR being just a very temporary moment in a larger evolution of technology, which is much more about mixed reality experiences of the world, right? I think we're very, very close to a point where VR, AR, MR are all collapsing together to become one weird, soupy, strange reality that's somewhere between the digital and the physical, but neither of those two things at the one time. And I think that's both an interesting and scary moment. It's a moment filled with wonder, but also intense fear. Whereas I described yesterday, what it means is that for the most part, all of us are going to exist in a world where we're potentially tuned to our own particular channels. Think the network bubble, but pull that out of the screen, make that spatial, and overlay that across the world. And that's the reality that I think we're all soon about to share or not share as maybe enabled, which means that I can be sitting in this room and the physical architecture of this space is less important than the digital world that I'm currently experiencing, which might be very specific for me, but totally different for you. Like, I'm a massive football fan, so I'm watching the Champions League game from last night while pretending to talk to you. There's a dude back there who's a massive porn fetishist, and he's not looking at me, but overlaid across me is his favorite porn actor, and we're all existing in this strange hybridized space where we used to talk about the virtual and the physical as being separate things, when VR leaves this thing strapped to our face and actually becomes a function of the everyday environment, it means that we're all going to be strangely existing in our own augmented bubbles.
So presence kills present.
Yes. That's a good way of putting it, yes.
Which is kind of a scare. It is kind of, it's so paradoxical, really, because we're trying to, in our attempt to define and tune into the granularity of presence, we're actually killing the most present possible mode that we can be in.
I guess so. I mean, there's still going to be, the VR is also going to, not VR, whatever VR becomes is also going to facilitate really interesting shared moments, but it's also going to allow us to tune out from each other. I think there are potentially implications where we can, we've all seen Black Mirror, right? When we can block people, where basically what it means is that all the functions of the screen, all the functions of CG environments, which at the moment are locked away in these strange glowing rectangles, actually become spatial and architectural and urban. And I think that has really strange and messy realities.
So I'm going to actually hop to Annina, which might kill Jackie because that's possible. Annina. I'm hopping slides. So it's the one that has because this is more this is better in terms of moving into the next sort of thought.
Yes. So I would say VR is a prosthetic. Did I pronounce it correctly? Because it's really hard word if you speak native in German. It reflects and it replaces and enhances physically, mentally, virtually, socially, for the good, sometimes for the bad. the notion prosthesis also implicates, refers to a certain imperfection or perfection. There's always a space in between, because some prosthetics, if you look at also these wonderful old pieces from the Museum of Technology in Vienna, it's, you know, it's, well, someone who has no hand. When he wants to eat, he chooses one of these devices, but at the same time, he couldn't play the piano or whatsoever. So that's a very interesting thought, and I witness this also now in virtual reality, because we can do some things in this virtual world, but a lot of things we can't do as our body can do if we're outside in the real world. And I also like the term of prosthetics, prosthesis, because it also refers to McLuhan, and I think we always have to keep him in mind. He's present with us. I think his spirit, you know, I wonder what he would say now to the development we are right in. Because, you know, he would also say it's always, every technology is an extension of ourself and of our nervous system, which actually also very well fits with this thing that virtual reality is very, has an impact on our brain and our feelings and our emotions. And, you know, because you talked about the context, I think it's, what I witness now with virtual reality, well, I worked very long time for a Museum of Technology, and I could see really the development of all those technologies, and there was this, you know, this always ongoing future thinking of technology, and then it shifted in this bias thing where we just see, okay, any technology always has a positive or a negative side. So you can't, VR is, on the one hand it's great, it's entertaining, but on the other hand it's scaring, and we really, and I totally agree, we have to see in which setting we are doing this. Because, yeah, the same thing we use now for beautiful arts projects, we just see also here in this beautiful Phi Center in the first floor. I really had fun yesterday trying out a lot of those things. On the other hand, the same technology can be used for manipulation. I was, in one of my nightmares was that I'm in a VR experience together with Trump. And yeah, so telling me, yeah, that's really a nightmare, I tell you. Even if his hair is funny, this man scares me. But just imagine this man is standing in front of you and tells you how politics works and how gender issues and all that stuff. So you should never dream of virtual reality and Trump at the same time. Yeah, please write that down. He will maybe tweet it. Yeah, so I think that's actually what I want to say. And all the pictures I chose this morning were early this morning, because I'm still jet-lagged. It's really important to keep them in mind that it's virtual reality is not new. It's the part of a development we have always been in since we use devices.
Well, I think what's clear in terms of how you guys flowed from one another is that we seem to think sometimes that, you know, we have no influence over how a technology develops, right? And that's part of the point that I was trying to make, which is like the regulatory environment is going to determine whether or not we will have, you know, echo chamber feeds influencing our daily lives, or we're going to have extensions of capability that enhances our daily lives. And this is something that we can't leave up to just others to sort out. We need to be quite committed to ensuring that the regulatory environment does that. And if Congress is any sort of marker on how well they understand this stuff, just go watch Zuckerberg being interviewed yesterday and you'll realize that we're in a lot of trouble because they can't understand anything. So Sandra, you're up next.
Woohoo! By the way, there is a project called VR Trump, and it is scary, and it is you and just him in the Oval Office and nothing happens, and I thought that was scarier. I don't know the point of this project, but it exists. So, my word is VR is reflexive. So yes, it's like my shirt. Reflexive means one thing. It means multiple things, but it means first thing, reflect, right? Like in a mirror. And I just thought, playing on the pun of VR, RV, it's also weird, really weird when you think about the word virtual reality. Virtual itself means an abstraction of reality, so it's a real abstraction of reality. Think about it. Virtual reality is a real abstraction of reality. There's a lot of real things going on, but it's a little bit, mind-puzzling. But it made me think about the other definition of reflexive. So the other definition of reflexive comes from social sciences, so yes, the nerdy side. And the nerdy side says reflexivity is what we call in modernity the capacity for a being to think about oneself. So overall, the capacity for VR to think about oneself and what is going on here. Every year we keep asking, but is VR really the future, let's say? Or maybe now it's AR, maybe now it's MR, maybe we should call it XR. Should it be called VR at all? Should it be called R2 for real reality, or is it R cube? So the definitions and redefinitions of VR is what a lot of people started saying. Actually, VR is like in its teenage years. It's trying to define itself. So back to your teenage magic kids. It's trying to define itself. Just let it time and it will get there. So my manifesto is never let it get there. Reflexivity in modernity means, cue the slide from Jean-Claude Van Damme, means being aware. So reflexivity means you think about yourself constantly, and that's the problem and beauty of modernity. You think about yourself constantly. You have to be aware about what you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're doing it, if you define yourself properly or not. And for me, that's maybe what will keep it alive. When we try to define too well a medium, it becomes stagnant, it kind of stays there. Just the fact that we're always thinking about it has had this push for VR and immersive media in the last years. So let's keep on being teenagers. I think that's a great momentum. We're trying to figure out who we are, how we want to be defined in the future, if it's the past. So many questions, but keep them coming.
So as teenagers, then it's just obvious that Miriam has to come next.
So I'm going to be this morning on the lighter side. This is my slide, VR rocks. I would have loved to be able to deliver like a speech like a rock star, but I didn't memorize my text, so I'm just going to read it. But I think it will fly. So for me, VR rocks, because for me, VR is completely in line with the basic informal meaning of the verb, namely to be extremely enjoyable, pleasing, or even impressive. And I have to say that I find it rather cool to wear big black glasses on your nose. It is kind of refreshing from the outside to observe people all dressed up in their VR gear. Sometimes it's not only headsets, but also backpacks, or even sensors on hands and feet, moving around like dancing with the wolves. It seems like they are experiencing some stunning new sensations, going from joy, excitement, to pain, and even fear. Sometimes they even perform strange deflections, movements, as they move along, following their own path in their own world. It always look like me, like rock and roll, and I like it. The main question is, why do people do this? Why are they not satisfied with sitting in comfortable cinema theater or relax at home in front of their screen computer or their television? What are they looking for? They must know by now that VR, AR, XR, whatever R, is not, at least from a technical point of view, perfect yet. That VR, like we know it today, will never be an end in itself, but only a temporary medium that will evolve into new directions. They must know that really good stories, films, or events are currently hard to find, and that most of the catching experiences are location-based and cannot be domestic. And when I look, for instance, at spaces like here at the Phi Center, where the public has access to experiences from all around the world, I ask myself, are those people searching for an escape? An escape from their lives, from their realities? Do they want to play with their feelings, their emotions, or do they simply want to enjoy themselves, have fun, and rock their world, their identity? I believe that is exactly these feelings of immersive interaction paired with 360 degrees dimensions and unknown digital sensations that allow you to experience that the freedom of creativity and the evolution of technology offered by virtual reality. The sole fact that you are stuck in your AV outfit allows you to realize that there is still a way out and that there is still a difference between heaven and hell.
Fantastic. And I think Louis Richard has an answer to your question.
Please.
Answer, I wouldn't say. So my statement goes this way. V is no escape from R. So we live in a space now, in our own virtual space, where we all feel, I think, as producers, creators, makers, that the possibilities are endless. Suddenly we're able to grasp profoundly into one's eyes, ears, touch, and maybe even more. But you can send the first picture. In the meantime, we're also very excited with all the possibilities the new data is allowing us to play with. Artificial intelligence is bringing new promises to the creative world. Do you know where this is? This is about 20 kilometers. Yeah, exactly. That's why I chose the picture. This is 20 kilometers from here, up the river. It's called the Beauharnois Electrical Central. Near from it, just here actually, is one of the biggest data center in the world. The data center we all need to do what we do in life. Those data centers now consume 10% of the world energy. So this is a question, and as you were saying, like, I think we may have a role to play in that. Can you show the other image? So this is an image I really much like from The Guardians. So we're playing with toys that are made out of plastic, metals extracted from mines all over the world. And all of those things renew themselves very fast, and we have to keep the pace to build better and better experiences within those technology. So for me, the important thing never to lose in our mind is really it oblige us as producers, creators, and makers to do very significant work for our society, or else we're just adding to the waste.
Yes. So as you can see, a variety of points of view, not necessarily all mutually exclusive, but if you layer them on top of one another, tell quite a complex story of how we're supposed to sort of work in VR, or how we're supposed to situate the VR industry. And I think maybe we can start this discussion by just getting a sense from all of you guys, since you've never heard each other's words, or how you're contextualizing the words. What are some of your thoughts around this layered, complex situation we find ourselves in, as articulated by your many descriptions of VR? Does anybody want to?
I was thinking about one thing when, Liam, you mentioned that thing that looks like, ski goggles in front of your face, and back to you when you said, actually, I like this, the way we can think even of the design of it. I was recently surprised to see young students, computer science students, but really focus on the aesthetics of the mask. So thinking less about, it's clunky, it's heavy, but now thinking about what if we could make it out of wood and maybe carve it. And so inspirations from back, in the early 20th century or late 19th century, if we could have something that is so aesthetic you would keep it in your house. And I just thought, that's not a debate that's going to bring, any new thought on VR. And then I thought, maybe it will. Maybe thinking about the aesthetics of the object itself instead of trying to push every time the content might help redesign what it's used for. So I thought I was limiting myself by thinking this is useless. Think about what you're doing with it. And they were thinking, no, it has to be something that I will want in my house forever.
Well, that's actually an interesting point you raise, because in a way, what I hear you say is like, the more explicit this computing object is, the more we might have to constantly be teenagers about it and think what it's for, right? However, it's not going to be like that, because again, to Moore's law, we're just in version 8 of this object. If you see pictures of old VR rigs, they're massive. They're now getting smaller, and they're just going to continue to get smaller until such point that they may in fact disappear, so that we now no longer have the physical objects and manifestations to help us understand what this medium is supposed to be for. How are we, in a way, it's easy for us to talk about Louis Richard's point, because we see that it is plastic. So we can be conscious about the physical consequences of VR. When it disappears, how would we actually understand those consequences?
Can I just reacting to this and Sandra's point, often when we decide to follow with a project, we ask, how is that technology relevant to what you want to say? How this technology serves the profound meaning of what you want to bring into the public space. But we never ask that question of, okay, so VR is definitely the technology to create a unique experience for you to understand the complexity of global change. But you're doing it with the device that's made and contributes directly to global change. So how to step forward and say, okay, maybe we should do it with bioplastic mask, and I'm just spinning. But this is the kind of question I never asked myself before. I'm just like starting to, learning about those energy crisis and all of stuff. So you're just, okay, how could I act upon that? I have no answer. If any of you have, I'm interested to hear.
There's a lot of pictures just popping up in my inner self. When I prefer that the VR goggle is visible, because I'm quite scared if I do not recognize anymore that someone is just in VR technology and I don't see it. But I also think if they do now fashionable, cool, fancy, glimmery, maybe they find some, with those glitter or whatever. I know that you can imagine everything. Maybe it's also an excuse, because at the moment I think all those companies designing those goggles, they have really difficulties to find better versions of them. And I actually always, after some time, even if I forget my contact lenses, it hurts. But I actually prefer it, because it really also reminds myself, okay, I'm now in this world. So, I'm scared if I'm not seeing this goggle anymore.
There is an experience right now upstairs in the exhibition called In the Eyes of the Animal, created by Marshmallow Laser Feast. They are based in London. Some of you, I'm sure, did it here upstairs, and they decided to send us like those huge helmets, and they are really heavy. And I would love for them to be here right now, because I would love for them to explain why they decided to have those heavy headsets. Because when you do the experience that lasts, I don't know, for 10 minutes or whatever, you have to put your hands under, because then it feels too heavy. So you are constantly, while you're doing the experience, you are aware that you have a really, really heavy headset on your head. Really, and it's actually, yes, please.
I just wanted to maybe spin around a little bit that idea of VR bringing more waste. Because VR, in a way, has the potential to replace our computer screen. VR and AR, if we put them together, replace our computer screen. Miniaturization, mobile VR might maybe replace those big CPU unit that we have on our desk. So, in a way, it might actually reduce waste from all the tools we're using every day.
Yeah, it is a trend that I've read through many articles, and that's true. And this is exactly my point. Me as a producer, how can I accelerate and engage in that? But I have to ask myself those questions, and I have to work with people ready to ask themselves those kinds of questions to move along those lines. Because this is where a promising avenue do exist. So this is sometimes, I'm just putting out there that we missed the time to ask ourselves those questions, because usually we want to prototype fast, we want to move fast, so we use the tool that are at hands, and we're not thinking about the tools. Maybe they are just like 2 steps, 3 steps ahead of us that are already kind of giving answers to those questions. This is.
And to follow up with what Miriam was saying, I think it's interesting that with VR we can now create a real world to especially in installation, to also enhance the experience, which is not something that we've seen in movie theaters for a long time.
And can I just add also, like, if any one of you saw the helmet, it's actually originally, I don't know now, it's a piece of the forest where the first experience was L. Yeah. So they are a good example of people asking themselves those kinds of questions, how to really embody not only the technology and what I want to say, but how to relate it to the reality of a place or a situation. So I do see it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I spent the last decade traveling around the world visiting the kind of landscapes that you showed from that Guardian image, tracing the systems behind the scenes of technology. The fact that we might wear a VR helmet instead of a screen is going to make absolutely shit of difference to the waste produced. I mean, it's like it's the infrastructure behind the scenes that powers all this stuff that's the real issue. Like, if you've ever sat in a data center, these massive machines designed to produce these experiences that at some point might be this little piece of glass on top of our face. The fact that it's no longer a big screen this size, but it's now a little thing this size, doesn't mean anything. What we need to be talking about is not. I mean, the problem is when we start talking about like the MacBook Air, which was seen as being some kind of efficient system because it removed us from the weight of what a computer was supposed to be. It just displaces that system of waste somewhere else, right? It means that we now need to have lithium mines in order for batteries to be as thin as they are in a MacBook Air. It means we need to have rare earth in order to make a screen a certain thickness. And there'll be similar implications with VR. It just shifts the discussion somewhere else. So I think it's really dangerous when we start to talk about the minimization of waste at just one point on that technological supply chain. Because what it means is that we're just focusing on our experience in a place like this, in a room like this, as opposed to the rare earth mine in the Congo, which ultimately gets shat on when we decide that VR is the next big thing.
Which is a great segue, actually, into, I think, an important thing to talk about in VR, which the originators of the bioapparatus call for applications residency in Banff raised. Okay, go ahead. You're allowed to interrupt.
Yeah, I actually would like to hear the rest of what Miriam wanted to say, because she was interrupted, and I wanted to hear her argument.
No, I mean, I was just referring to the helmet, and then I would have liked to hear the Marshmallow Laserfeast people, like, what was in their mind when they decided to create those really heavy helmet. I have an idea, but I don't want to talk for them. So no, I was not really interrupted. I'm fine, but thank you.
It's funny. MLF, with friends of mine, we worked on a lot of stuff together. I had a piece in that same festival where they premiered it. I wish it was about the weight of the helmet. Their discussion was just they hate the look of HTC Vives, so they needed to cover it up. When you were supposed to experience it, the helmets hang from trees. So that you don't feel the weight of the helmet, that the tree carries that weight. But I like it. I like the angle that you're going with.
Did you see it upstairs here?
I haven't played it.
I'll take you upstairs.
All right. Okay. But I don't know. I think what's interesting is that almost every artist has their own version of the headset. There'd be a very quick book to do, which is now all of the artist-made headsets. I don't know. I'm intrigued to. Again, I think this is just a very temporary moment. Like if you look at the evolution of the camera, that begins as something very big and clunky, and now has totally disappeared, even though the intense privacy issues that come along with the disappearance of the camera is really problematic. The idea that we might hang on to this physical piece because somehow it grounds us in the distinction of what is real and what is not. I wish were the case, but I guess the entire history of technological evolution suggests the opposite, I suppose. But maybe we can regulate that stuff. I don't know.
But I think that's where I was going to go, and funnily enough, your intervention supports the next kind of thing I want to discuss, which is power structures. Okay, and so because that is the key issue, I think, in relation to everything we're talking about with VR, whether we talk about it from a technology supply chain layer, whether we talk about it in terms of the power structures between the subject and the object, whether we talk about it in terms of the power structures between the people who have monopolized or have monopolies around the technologies, and then the creators who are then using them, to the relationship between sort of the body and the experience. So power is something that they definitely wanted to interrogate in 1991 in that bioapparatus residency at Banff. And I don't hear about this often enough when we talk about VR at festivals, at conferences. Can you guys sort of...
Yeah, I think yesterday I was super glad with your introduction that you mentioned the Kool-Aid. I told you yesterday when we were having lunch, I said, I don't know why. Recently, I think my motto when I bring back to panels or stages to talk about immersive media or new development in media, my motto is don't drink the Kool-Aid. And the reason for it is I think there's two objectives for both artists and scientists, which I like to call myself having a foot in a bit of each world, and it's to disrupt, question and disrupt. So I was making a fun pun about reflexivity as a teenager, but reflexivity really is us humans not being gullible, thinking about power structures, thinking about our own decisions in life as not something that's a given, but something that is culturally constructed, socially constructed. So what I mean also by VR needs to be reflexive. That reflexivity means trying to go back to understanding why it's developing the way it is and who's making these decisions. So when we go back to the previous years of VR, I'm always surprised at how more diverse the people getting interested in VR is. Recently, we have a lot of talks about, wow, so many women in VR. And I can almost call, just wait a couple of years and there's going to be less. The only reason for it being every time there's a new medium, even when we discover the beginnings of the cinema, the diversity of the people who compose that medium is greater than when the power structures start to impose a certain line. So I'm giving like a kudos to Samara here, because the VR anti-manifesto was exactly this. We said we need a manifesto. Actually, we don't. The first moment you start saying it's a manifesto, you're starting to narrow the possibilities. And the more you narrow the possibilities, power structures come into play. Who gets to narrow them? So like this is the more serious aspect of reflexivity, but the idea is this, right? I think it is something that is lacking from a lot of the VR debates, and that is the Kool-Aid. So sometimes I understand why too. You need to sell the medium as something not scary. So that is the first part of the discourse, and the narrative was VR is actually a lot more amazing than you think. It is not this weird make-believe world where we'll be escaping into. But then the flip side of this is now people are only saying, this is the empathy machine. This is the thing that will solve all problems. And you have to bring it back to, it's a statement, it's an experience, it's a medium. So I love that Marshmallow Laser Feast decides to bring attention to the headset, but make it part of the experience, not something that's an escapism from this reality. It's part of the reality where we're expressing each other.
But are you saying that we're still at the divergent stage of this, or do you see the walls starting to narrow?
The wall's narrow, but what I like is that there's always disruptors. Just like in this room, there's people who are here and have this little exclamation points that can actually disrupt the conversation. So disruptors are needed, and they're always there. Sometimes you just need to remind them that they're there. Just don't drink the Kool-Aid. Some of them will never drink it.
Others? Thoughts on power?
Well,
Go ahead.
it's just a thought, and it's probably my pragmatic sense talking, but I'm pretty sure that all of those discourse need to happen. But if I take it from a production and creation and maker who needs to survive into our world, how do you bring those questions to a level where they can be activated in decision making in day-to-day situation? This is the kind of question I have when you talk about those power structure, and you've mentioned it very well. They overarch over centuries often. So how, as a creative collectivity, do you make sure that you won't change the world, but you could make a significant difference in the world? And that happened before. Artists do that over time. It happened in the French Revolution. It happens in different societies. Sometimes poets take control and start revolution and bring a new balance into a country. So it is possible. History has shown us that creators can do something different. But in today's world, where concentration of power is never seen before, how to embed that in our everyday process. And I would like, not now, but like the millennials thing. I think I would be interesting to get the feeling or have others people's perspective, because I think that may be a generation giving at least pats to those.
We're talking about the magic kids, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think there's a collective. There's an attempt towards collectivism that appeals to the younger generations, perhaps, that could be used around. Hang on a second. Could be used around how we might actually start that process of creating collective creative energy. And a voice to present an alternative view as to how VR can evolve or how VR should be used. Yeah, sir.
I think it's very exciting what's happened. Thank you. It's very exciting what's happened with the Parkland kids. It's very easy to get encouraged by that, to talk about magic teenagers. It's the same generation gave us Gamergate and the alt-right. Let's not forget that. It's the same generation that occupies, some of them at least, 4chan, that are involved in quite terrible harassment of minorities online. So I think there's a Kool-Aid there that we need to not drink as well, potentially.
I agree. It's just that if there are spring buds coming up off this kind of horrible earth that we're trying to show you guys, then it's also important for us to show where some of those spring buds might be.
I mean, is there? You guys might know better than I do. Is there an open source headset? Yeah. Is there?
There's OSVR.
Well, tell me about the OSVR. I don't know what that is.
Oh, it's an open source VR headset.
Okay. Is it any good?
It's not as well used as others, but I think there are certainly different privacy and data sort of terms and conditions attributed to the various headsets. So if you look at Oculus terms and conditions versus HTC Vive terms and conditions versus others, there are differences. And HTC Vive seems to suggest currently, based on interviews with their CEO, that they have more sensitivity towards those things.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I also wonder I mean, again, you probably know, is there like platforms for distribution of VR content, like on the OS VR? Can you actually watch anything because everything else is locked away in other platforms?
They work across. I mean, I think the most promising, but still very early, would be web VR based stuff. So Mozilla's working on a number of WebVR open standards. Yeah.
So, well, go ahead. It's your time.
Let the girls speak. Two thoughts on power I would like to add. The one is that VR in itself has a power to change our cultural practice. So, do you remember when we still did this gesture for calling someone?
Obviously not. It took me a second.
And then we did. Then we had. I saw actually young kids. They didn't know how to handle it. Also in the Museum of Technology, and then you had this gesture, and now you have, I don't know, it's more a smooth gesture. So the VR practice. Yeah, or you know, Siri. Yeah, I mean, of course, I'm not using so far. I don't know why I'm comfortable using Siri, but those gestures, they will change also with VR. So there's a power in it. And I always think it's the main thought. Bruno Latour, the French philosopher Bruno Latour, that's why he got so popular also in museums. That there's always a wise, I don't know how to say, an interlink in effect in our practice, and it changes really our gestures, our thinking, our perception. So that's one point I want to state. And the other one, it's completely different. It's the power between the wealthy nations and the non-wealthy nations. And yeah, so that's all I wanted to add.
Can I just go to the other, like,
sure.
Yeah, just jump. So what we were talking just before that is, to me, that's exactly the kind of avenue that I may have as a producer influence on. Yeah. Now that I know there's an open VR helmet, like one of the thing we're finding right now is that the way to reach people is to create an experience where people will actually take the metro or go somewhere there except to pay something. And Miriam has been a leader in that and proving that here at the Phi Center. Like, people are ready to pay to live to an experience, but our default is to go with HTC or Oculus. And if a number of producers were to say, oh, okay, there's another option. This option is valuable. It's of quality. Do we try to move in that direction consciously? This is the kind of things I'm asking myself more and more, and just to say, okay, so the moment you know there's another possibility, and this is the challenge, and it brings us back to the power structure, how to make sure regulate so that those guys are not just bought by the other one and the technology is incorporated. But to me, this is the kind of thing I'm always trying to find, and they're very small, so they're very hard to see. And us as a community, just sharing those kinds of information would be a start. And as you mentioned yesterday, there's no media. Well, Immerse is one step ahead, but from Immerse from MIT. Coming out of Open Doc Lab, it's a magazine. You can look it up. It's online. But this is the kind of opportunity that are standing before us. We just need to act upon them.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's what I was getting at when I was asking these questions about open source VR. Because what we see happening at the moment is just a reinforcing of the existing platforms of distribution, right? Like, there's a few companies that either own the headsets or own the platforms. I'm sure that there are alternative distribution models, but for the most part, the people funding good VR content are these same platforms, right? Which talks about this larger question you raised about power structures, that no technology is independent of those systems. All they really do is just reinforce existing cultural models. Technology is no solution necessarily to any problem. It just exaggerates the problems that already exist. And that's what you see, I think, happening with VR. So unless we actually talk about the funding of media production, we're not really going to be affecting change within those systems with any particular VR project at all, right? Like, we need to be talking about how we can fund that work outside of these same big media companies. Because as a producer, you're making new work. you sit down and you have a conversation with HTC, with Oculus. You figure out who's going to give you the best deal, and then you do it, right? There's got to be another way to fund that system.
Well, I'm old enough to have done some VRML 25 years ago, so virtual reality markup language, and it was at the time of the internet also being more and more present. And I remember that we were considering the internet as maybe something so open and free and available to all, and potentially a new positive system of government and everything. And I think we talked about that in the Manifesto last year, is the idea of capitalism and always have to make money and profit, and how do you finance these projects is a big deal. And VRML never really worked because, well, technology was not ready, but also the different big company, Microsoft, Netscape at the time, were competing for the standard. And internet became what it is now because of the standard. So I think we have, as Louis Richard was saying, we have to try to push web VR as much as we can and make it open and keep it open as much as possible.
Well, Mark Pesce, who invented VRML, is currently working on a set of standards right now around permissions. So as the web migrates to the real world, one of the things that we need to sort out is, like, you know, who gets to put stuff on my feed in my real world? How can I put stuff that's in my feed on someone else's feed in the real world? So how you negotiate those permissions is going to be a critical piece of this infrastructure that we're building. So being aware of the pieces, those building blocks, infrastructure building blocks, I think is also going to be critical to some form of collective action if we decide to go that route, you know?
I was going to say, so there's a role as producers, thinking about the type of technology that you're going to use, or to choosing how to do your project. But even as creators, I'm trying to juggle my memory. So because this is like we never returned from the bar and we're still here, please help me juggle my memory. But there's an artist that was present this year at IDFA who did a project about the rights of gestures. So basing it on the HoloLens. And I think that is awesome, when suddenly you can take a technology and its flaws to bring light on the flaws of that technology. That kind of meta loop I love. You know, I see Louis Richard going like this because I keep redoing this kind of meta loop of using the technology to talk about the technology. But I think in this approach, this artist, who else remembers him? But you remember the project, right? Okay, we're going to Google it and figure out, as I speak, it's happening. It's amazing. That's the thing. I don't know what it's called. So it's the project, let me just explain. It's a HoloLens project, but it's showing how Microsoft HoloLens is already deciding on the gestures you can no longer use in augmented reality. So because some of their gestures are now patented, if you're pointing somewhere and said, this gesture is not accepted, this gesture has been patented by Microsoft. So you're ringing up the phone, or maybe, you know, you'll be in your HoloLens virtual world, you'll try to do this gesture, and it keeps telling you what you can no longer do because that company, Microsoft, has already patented the gesture. Patent alert. There you go.
Miriam, you had something to add?
Well, I just want to take a step back when we were talking about the Kool-Aid. And I have a question, like it's for all of us, but it's for all of you. Like, when won't VR be a buzzword anymore? Like, when it's been like 2 years, I don't know. Like, at some point it's gonna go down. So when, and what after? You have the answer? Please.
2.5 years.
From my very limited experience of watching the scene from very outside, I think for most, to look at it from a consumer's perspective, when it becomes cheap enough for normal people to use it, because it's still cost prohibitive. I think that's the main issue that the medium has. It's a niche product for rich techies at the moment. You know, I mean, there's the phone-based stuff, but that's a horrible experience that most people, you give it to most people and they're like, oh, that's cool, I think, and then they move on to something else. Or they're looking at 360 video stuff, which is similarly like unrewarding. The only thing the Vive and the Oculus headsets are interesting. The PlayStation headset was interesting, but it's still too expensive. That's the main problem.
Hi. I wanted to kind of insert a couple of thoughts in the question of power and, when does this stop being a buzzword? And I worry about who the we are when we're talking about this. Who are us and our and we, and who are we that we have the agency to sit here and talk about it, but this is going to be used to oppress people. That's when it stops being a buzzword, when we're using it for labor in factories, where you're using VR to do stuff. If you've seen a movie called Sleep Dealer, that's a really good example of where this is going, I think, in terms of who has the power to do what with it. I'm worried about it, and I think talking about drinking the Kool-Aid and talking about digital natives is not a thing, I don't think. It's a thing that really worries me when we use that, because we still have to learn how to be in the digital world. There's no such thing as a digital native. There's nobody born with the ideas of, unless you're born in VR, I guess, you would know what that is. But I worry about some of these conversations where we talk about us as people who make this thing, but we don't talk about the people who are affected by it in some ways in Congo or in wherever the waste goes and how we turn this over, but also who has access to it. And it's worrying in the ways that y'all have said about how we've learned about the history of technology and what it does to people and what it allows and what it magnifies. And VR is part of that entire family, and so that worries me a little. So,
but is it better for you not to be part of it, or better for you to be part of it?
I'm on team burn it down. So
sorry,
I'm on team burn it all down. So but very much.
But I guess the issue has to do with the fact that this stuff is going to happen. And what's more worrisome if artists aren't involved in some of the ways in which we actually interrogate this stuff. Because it's not like they're waiting for art. It's not like things are going to stop if artists and thinkers and creators and people from diverse communities don't participate. It's not like it's going to ground to a halt. So how do we? Yeah.
But this is an example. This, like Beaumarchais, in like way past. He was many things, but a theater writer also. So this was the medium of his time, and that medium at that time was fréquenté, attended by the powerful of that time, and it is an historical fact that he actually, through his theater, was a contributor to the uprising of the French throwdown of the monarchy. So this is, I think you're totally right, but we're condemned as creators or people who wish for a better world to grasp those technology in the same way the military put them on those people driving the drones.
I like the word condemned.
Yeah, you're kind. Yeah, well, it is. It is a power struggle. So it's and the power balance isn't totally balanced actually. So this is the kind of difficult questions. With like, how can we do something to make it better and make sure that someone in a factory somewhere is not handling the toxic waste of my opportunity to experience all those things, and it's not like an easy answer, but you have to ask yourself those answers at one point.
I'll throw like oil in the fire and cause a bit of an issue here, okay? The biggest problem right now, unlike 1991 in Banff, fast forward 2017, okay? The creative industries have become implicated in this interrogation of this medium, okay? So you've got a capitalist creative system as one of the stakeholders, creator stakeholders, in this kind of conversation between artists and technologists. And it's not very clear where they sit in this type of ongoing discussion about the role of technology as it relates to society. So this is where it gets really difficult, because now you've got money, a lot more money in the sort of growth and evolution of VR, and you've got a continuum of creators that are involved in it, ones that are much more interested in commercial pursuits, not to say that they're, not interested in social issues, but perhaps not. And then those who are really artists who are really looking at this in terms of how we need to think about this technology and figure out how we relate to it, right? And then a whole bunch of people in between. So how do you negotiate a conversation amongst a variety of players who have skin in the game, are competing for resources, and have really different intentions?
You
go to space.
Yeah, I have like such competing thoughts, but the first one that pops into my mind is the cell phone and the haves and have-nots. So over the late 1990s, the debate was, how do we reduce the digital divide by making sure that everybody has access to the internet, and then everybody has access to kind of a segue into what is the future to come. And so the line for that future to come was defining the haves and the have-nots. And recently, quite really out of the blur, but I was brought back to a couple of years back where I was studying actually this thing, and I had to say to somebody, it kind of makes me think about VR today. So the have and have-nots, the idea was make sure that all the have-nots have, right? The only problem is, to give you a perfect example, cell phones were used in Cameroon in a way that made Canada and United States look stupid. They looked like they were the future and we were really in the past. What happened then is we start changing the definition of have and have not. So it's no longer have access to a phone, now it's owning a phone. Oh, well then that flips the balance again. So that power struggle is even ongoing in definitions. If you're saying access to VR versus owning VR, you're getting into that same dilemma. Is it important to have VR headset in your house or to access VR headsets? So, and in that certainty, we're bringing back to and I completely agree with you with sometimes wanting to be on the burn it all down team, when suddenly the discourse is everybody should have one in the classroom. You're like, the competing thoughts start to be about, we're back into the you should own one or you should have one, and that is a selling discourse, but it's not about the medium anymore.
But it's not even just access from a distribution and presentation perspective,
but it's access
to
the
production. Tools to make it.
Exactly.
I also want to add, who controls what the content you're accessing. If you're allowed to use VR only through Facebook, that's already happening. Facebook controls internet access in many countries, and they control what content you see. We are right now apparently in a conversation about how that has disrupted certain, I don't know, you know what I'm talking about when I say that. So it's also about that. When we talk about the control, it's not just the physical things, it's who controls the internet, who controls the advertising, we're going to be, VR advertising is a hellhole. I'm terrified of that. Think about, we have it on the internet now, what's it going to look like when VR becomes a commercial thing? Right. Oh my God.
But the flip side of my competing thought was that on one end, I understand very well when you're trying to push a technology down the throat of everyone, and then you really feel like, okay, the power struggle here is not good. But then I'm thinking about Hyphen Labs that did a project called Neurospeculative Afrofeminism. I can't believe I just knew how to say that in one shot. Mm-hmm. Like it came out of nowhere. But Neurospeculative Afrofeminism, did it twice. This project is 3 young women not knowing how to code. Well, one of them knew how to code, never touched VR before, and they decided, we want to have a role because we're going to use this to wash people's brains of their prejudice. And so they did an entire installation where you would be in a beauty salon, where you would get a headset on, and it washed your brain of your prejudice. And I thought it was so funny, well done, smart, and the objective is exactly this. If you burn it all down, some people will still control where it's going. So you have that struggle where I'm not sure about saying just don't even touch it or, take control of it. I'm not sure. I'm struggling.
Can you search for this? Just it's I was looking at it's the number of DK1 and DK2 distributed into the world in I recall the exact, but it's pretty obvious. It's pretty connected to the subject we're discussing. So those were sent out to people, to makers, or wannabe makers, or people that were ready to try to build something with those new technology. And the way they're spread out to the world is pretty interesting. You have like, the numbers are going to appear, but it's like 56, 60, and when you go to Central America and Africa, it's actually 353 and 31. So those kinds of things, if you actually know them as a creator or a maker, you say, oh, maybe I should try to associate to South African, for instance, which is something that some Ingrid does. It's like you have to teach them in order to train them not to be able to react to this publicity in VR. They have to own it in somewhere, or they have to feel that they have an agency of acting. And this is where, even if it's drinking the Kool-Aid, the younger generation I still hope, have more hope in the future. I hope. Maybe I'm naive, but if not, then I might as well hop on Elon Musk's next ship to the moon. So this is kind of the numbers that we don't see often, but this is, to me, going back to my statement, this is reality. This is the reality of what we're doing. And the numbers are out there. And the source are okay, I think.
This is 2015. It's a little bit higher now.
I find it interesting that we're shocked by this, right? Because I describe all this stuff as before culture technologies, right? Which is to say that all of these things are coming at us faster than our cultural capacity to understand what they mean. Because we're still having a conversation about the distribution of smartphones, the global distribution of smartphones. Now we're talking about the distribution of VR. We barely figured out what it means when music transitions from a physical object to a shareable file. We're still figuring out what the fuck the internet means, what Facebook is. Now we've got to also figure out what VR is. And ideology, it doesn't evolve as fast as the innovations in these technologies, right? So we're still having a conversation about the distribution of technologies and the have and have-nots. Like it's some kind of it's a new thing in the context of VR. We haven't we're trying to solve VR now. We haven't figured out how to solve the fucking internet yet, right? And I don't know that. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I'm not giving a solution either. So I'm just probably compounding the problem. But I think recognizing that. I guess to go back to my original point, like recognizing that these things aren't necessarily new, they're just exaggerating and extending existing power structures, means that we should have a conversation about ideologies, not necessarily a conversation about the technology. Not that you can separate them, but to look at these things from a cultural perspective, I think is much more important. Like why? Yeah, like we should have been having that discussion about Facebook that the world had yesterday, a decade ago. Like why we had to wait for it to be everywhere until that happened. Which is why I guess I'm excited by the discussions around VR, because it's not here yet, at least in the form that it's everywhere. So maybe we can start to shift the evolution of this thing if we have more conversations around it like this.
Yeah.
Can I pick the word cultural from you?
Yeah.
Sorry. I would like to pick the word cultural you just stated and twist it to intercultural. I think one thing at least I didn't really look very much at it, or not at all, to be honest. How the perception of VR is in different countries, even if in some countries it's not really there. But I know in Japan, if you think, what does this technology mean in other societies on this planet? What happens when I don't know, someone in India, someone in Japan, someone in China? I think we should have some people from China also in our conversation. So maybe this leads now somewhere completely different, but it just comes to my mind that it would be really nice to have a discussion with people from those areas together on one stage and see what VR means in their social environment and in their society and practice.
I think your point is really interesting. It gets back to what we were saying earlier. Like, it's still like the happy few, and I totally agree that there is no, like, we should talk about what they do in Africa. And I think the point you brought, what Ingrid did with Ingrid being she's a programmer at Tribeca, but she's also she lives in South Africa, and she did a program where is it African Dream or what's
Electric South?
Electric South, exactly, to give the opportunity to people in different countries in Africa to create, to produce, and I think there's a lack of diversity. It's not represented, and it's still, going back to your point, it's still we're amongst the happy few, and the conversation has to be open.
I was just thinking about what those sorts of things mean. Like, if we really, like, if we dive into this stuff that you're saying, that I'm saying, I don't know, I've been on, like I say, a bunch of these. I was just at South by Southwest, and the last time I was at South by Southwest, it's all about monetizing Twitter. This year it was all about monetizing VR, and everything was VR, and every panel had the word fucking VR in it. I'm just wondering what the alternative to that is, to discussing it in rooms like this one. Like, do we want to have a Senate hearing on VR next week? Like, if you know, we should have had the Facebook one 10 years ago, should we have a Senate hearing on VR?
Well,
Is that the way to have a more meaningful conversation about it?
I mean, you kind of twigged it for me in your previous comment, which is like, we have, 23 more minutes to go. Like, what are the unintended consequences of us sort of putting in so much money into our current present conceptions of what VR is and our sort of limited understanding of it currently, that we should be aware of? Like right now, as an example, okay, of this unintended consequences, I was just in France with a variety of festival curators of VR. So the folks who are running this festival in South Africa, et cetera, all over the world. And everyone's very excited about VR. And they are running labs about VR. Almost all of their labs are 360 video capture labs, okay, where they hand cameras to the indigenous populations, where they then capture 360 videos of various themes that they're interested in, and then that becomes the dominant sort of subjects and projects that they present at these festivals. And so let's look at that and say, okay, is that enough in terms of how we conceptualize what the VR medium could and should be? And how do we start to think about the unintended consequences of certain ways we conceptualize what VR is today, and whether or not these attempts that we have at making it more accessible are really going far enough?
Well, Samara made a comment in the beginning. She said, what is it, creative reality lab? How are you guys calling it? And actually it came from first attempt about 2 years ago. They called it, it's going to be a VR lab. And my first reaction was, no. Anything but VR. We're doing VR now. Tomorrow will be XR. The next day will be MR, maybe we'll go back to VR, who knows. But I really strongly believe, that quote that is very kitschy and has like images in the back but keeps recircling. We shouldn't be victims of we shouldn't be victims of the future, we should be its architects. And I keep thinking that is true. So whenever we're talking all these conversations about VR, I'm a little surprised that we keep thinking that VR is a headset on top of your head because it blocks you from the outside world. I kind of foresee a future where we're not sure what name we're going to stop on, but we understand that medium being immersive. So an immersive medium, an immersive format, an immersive storytelling, an immersive story sharing, but something that is immersive. But you're right that a lot of the discourse is just about VR.
Or even, but if you reduce it to its practical level, right, which is what you said, you know, we should be talking about, if we're going to learn from what's happening with Facebook today, our core conversations around the immersive future should be on ideologies, both as they relate to the aesthetic form as it relates to the actual infrastructure, right, and not the technologies. And yet, from a practical reality, what typically happens in labs is that what gets distributed are the technologies. So the 360 cameras get distributed. And the cheapest ones of the 360 cameras get distributed. And then the teaching of how to shoot in 360 gets disseminated. And there's hardly any conversations around ideology. So that's really the core issue, is that if we don't actually start to privilege the ideological foundations of how a medium gets made or how a medium gets invented, because it's so much easier, because the practicalities bump up against that, then we're going to face the same issues that we're going to face, that Facebook has faced 10 years from now. And so how do we manage that as people who run centers, who run labs, who, you know.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to make a parallel with something that was said in the beginning about a parallel with cinema, and how at the beginning it had a lot more people involved. And although, I mean, yes, there were a lot of thinkers in there at the beginning. Méliès was one of them. It eventually took about like 70 years for like world cinema to really like come about, and for cinema to be democratized enough for people to do things interesting with it, like in Africa or South America. And maybe also there's kind of like a certain level of maturity or in standardization that needs to be achieved, or distribution levels, before people and new generations actually can do something else with it and kind of tweak the power structures, or the fact that technology is not neutral, it comes with an ideology, and they can really like grasp it and do something else. And I don't know, it seems to me that it took a lot of years for cinema. And maybe just another thing about like the future is not VR. I don't know if anyone wants to comment about calm technology, the concept by Mark Weiser and John Seeley Brown that is being brought back by people like Amber Case, David Rose, or Golden Krishna. And those people are strongly against any types of screen and tangible media. And I think maybe also we think to think about like what's coming next. McLuhan famously said that like a new technology doesn't replace what came before, but displace it. So maybe that's something that we need also to think about, what's the place it's going to take, and not just think about it in terms of like replacing current technologies, but how it will take its place among other things.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm not responding to your question, but just to expand a bit on what I was talking about with VR, not the future. That I mean, I guess what happens, I think, is that like I can imagine there's just a few more issues to solve with AR and machine vision and real world recognition before AR supplants VR, and then it just becomes an issue of dialing up or down the opacity with which we view the real world, right? Like we can choose to have a fully immersive experience and dial down a physical experience, or we can kind of have this hybrid, or we can go kind of fully analog and just dial it right back. Like I think that's a very easy to imagine future where the screens dissolve, but all the functions of the screen just become functions of the environment. So I guess that's what I was meaning by VR is not the future, is that it just shifts in a similar way that you were saying with McLuhan and displacement. It just shifts the conversation from a screen-based culture to a culture of hallucinations and strange holograms that somehow just exist out into the world, and whether that's from contact lenses or the next generation of Google Glass, which is currently being developed behind closed doors, or whatever it is. I don't know, but that still it seems to be the ambition that we have for this tech.
I want to make sure we have 15 minutes, and I want to make sure we've got comments from the audience, from the agitators who haven't commented yet. Anyone? Yeah. Okay. Where are you?
Wow. Upstairs.
Second floor.
What? Oh, there you are. Okay.
I'd like to know why are you talking about ideological foundations? Because we're talking about screens. We're talking about, maybe ethic, but why ideological foundation? I would like to know more about that.
Why ideology versus ethics?
Yeah.
I think ethics are embedded in how one thinks about ethics is embedded on your potentially ideological position.
Yeah, but why do you think that we need to think about ideological foundation for how the media gets made?
Oh, because I think we have to be. Well, actually, I'll let Liam answer that too. I think it's because sometimes we can easily just think about the practical sort of technological realities and assume, as the gentleman over there said, that technology is neutral and that we're just creating in this kind of vacuum outside the context of where power resides, how subjects get how we think about subjectivity in a medium, etc. Those are all part of how we think about power and its relations in a particular system. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but what is the difference between this VR and the other medium?
Oh, there's no difference. Only that in other. And so one way to think about it is to say, okay, as Liam said, the same systemic things just get amplified in this media, right? But what tends to happen, and we've seen it in VR, is the novelty factor of a new particular technology or medium gets people excited, and they get disconnected from all of the other stuff that happened prior to it, as though somehow it's a totally new thing, removed from all of the systems it lives inside. And so we start talking about it as this kind of untethered, novel space where we don't have to think about politics, where we don't have to think about power structures, where we don't have to think about aesthetic precedents, etc.
So Anya said we are in other countries. So I'm from Japan. So can I say about Japan? Yeah. So I saw many, most of all Japanese are using to meet animation character in VR. So yeah, like you guys are using in VR Trump or going to cool 3D world, but ours is so different. So yeah, our desire is so different, and usually we don't want to connect society trip from this society usually. So that's why, that is big difference between here and from Japan, I think.
Can I answer by a question? Like, to all of us creators, whatever the kind, and I think there is a connection. I see a little one between what we're discussing, but one thing that fascinates me is the main driver of design, of everything we design, is how to capture for the longest time possible the attention of someone. And everything is based on that motivation of, okay, if I want to do something good, the result should be I will capture that person's attention. So to me, this is kind of a possible paradigm shift where you say, okay, so let's not design from that starting point. I have no idea from what other starting point to design, but it appears over the last year, being to South by Southwest conferences, everything seems to be about capturing with the most vivid and profound way the attention of someone. Is really what do we need to do? Is everything has to be designed?
That's what got Facebook into trouble.
Yeah, exactly. When Facebook, like Twitter, everything's designed in that way.
Yeah. I'm really happy you just talked about how you perceive and how you like to use VR. So I really think if we want to have a good conversation about what this technology should mean for our society, we have to get together with you from Japan, from China, from all those countries with really different practices in what technology is and the relation to technology, to figure out also rules and yeah. So let's meet together the next time. And well, we just now had this wonderful exchange program between Germany and Canada, but I feel it's a bit a different conversation here than in Germany, but still it's quite the same. And it's I got really bored going to film festivals and those VR slots because it really replicates, and I miss this really open conversations with people from all these different areas, and we need it because VR is perceived completely different in different parts of the world.
Any other?
Hello. You just compliment what I was going to say. Like, please invite me to the next conversation about ideology, because as Anna said before, there's few talks about this when we talk about VR. And that's one of the main questions that I face when working with this in this medium. So I am agree that we definitely need more meetings and more places where we discuss where the ideological everything of VR. Like, I mean, in terms of how do we face it, how do we understand it. So I really feel that we should get together more and then hear more about what you guys have to say about that, like in terms of only ideological thinking of this medium. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks. Anyone else? No. Okay, so I'd love to hear last words from each of you.
I don't know. I'm just flowing on from these comments. Like again, I'm trying to, and like, you know, I think it's useful to follow some of these thoughts through and just see like what would they actually then mean on the ground. Like you know, are we going to bring in the head of Oculus and HTC, stick him in front of the Senate and then like grill them about maybe that's what we need, or like if we're talking about like bringing all these people from different countries together to discuss VR, should we do a global summit?
I think that's a South by Southwest thing. We could do a mock debate.
No, but don't do it at don't do it at South by Southwest. It's a lot like they do it in.
Hear it though.
Like attach it to the next global summit on climate change or something. Like it's not.
And Elon Musk will disrupt it.
Sorry? Yeah. Like it's not going to happen. Like, you know, I've been to Transmedial every year and, you know, people sit up here and talk about data privacy. It's not until it happens in Facebook in the US Senate that something might change. They might regulate something. It should happen not just in rooms like this. It's not about like bringing a bunch of cool and interesting people from different places into the next MUTEK or the next South by Southwest or the next Transmedial or Stripe or Sonar or whatever it is. It's about trying to look at how real things come into force and like what happens when these conversations are allowed to leave these rarefied spaces.
Shall we crash Davos?
Where do they go? Sorry?
Shall we crash Davos?
VR
Davos,
already crashed Davos, and it's a bit of a pain that they did.
Let's be real.
Yeah, I just think, like, I guess that would be my closing remark, is that just because I've been a part of so many of these exciting conversations, I think that we need to get better at transcending the walls of festivals like this and thinking about how a meaningful discussion about the cultures that exist around technologies or are produced by technologies exist and find traction out in the rest of the world. And I think that should be a real important project for everyone, and also should inform the work that we make and who we think of the audience for that work might be.
Great. Yeah, I would also I already said before that was actually also one of my main statements, get the discussion out of our little bubble, open it up. And I think it would also be interesting to have discussions, the ones doing the publicity, the ads, the wonderful ads about the coolness of VR. We should talk to them. And I just, at the beginning of the year, I had a book in my hand I found in a library in Portugal about the remote control, the device of the remote control. And the ads that first gave the remote control in those wonderful old-looking pictures, nicely dressed women and men in the living room. They gave it into the hand of the man. And then somehow they figured out it sells better if they give the remote control into the hand of a woman. So unfortunately, I don't have a picture now with me, but yeah, I think it's also good, just try to imagine what it differs if you give in an ad the same device, a different person, different gender, different race. Yeah, that's also influencing VR. So yeah, I think that's all I can say. Yeah.
I would go back to one part of your opening remarks. I think we've been inventing new technology for almost all the time, but with an acceleration since the industrial revolution and information revolution. And I feel sometimes that we're looping in the same kind of ideological questioning and stuff like that. So what do we have to take out of 200 years of history and to seize the opportunity when suddenly new mediums, I should say, the S I think is important because of the RAR, XR, whatever, and AI on top of that. So I think it is important to try to bring in historians also. Sometimes you see them, but the presence of Historia and the key learnings that were done at different, sometimes they're not enough infused in those kinds of situations.
I'd like to see more spaces like the Phi Center in the world. Because the reason we're doing that mainly here is really to democratize the access to VR. To as you said earlier, like there's not that much people that have the headsets or the gear, whatever, at home. So if there were more places in the world like the Phi Center, like just to democratize the access would be great.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Phi Center also as a place of curating content. So the question falls back into what kind of content do we get to see? Discussing VR with people, let's say, at the custom border, which I think is hilarious. What do you do for a living? And you have to explain something in a nutshell without them flagging you as weird. So the word VR before used to be weird. Now VR, the last time the Border Patrol started talking about it, he said, oh, I get nauseous in that, roller coaster one. And I thought that means his access to VR content is 360 video of a roller coaster and or a couple of other experiences, probably zombies, but it's always the same types of access. That's the limited access, that's what they access. Places like Phi Center where people can access all sorts of other experiences of being inside the head of an animal, for instance, or experiencing what else it could be, I think is the first spark into imagining another future for this medium. And I think last year I introduced the VR anti-manifesto with that other world of ours. I think since forever we're dreaming about the new medium that will allow us to explain that other inner world that we want to express to somebody else. So my idea is to bring back story after VR is, we're now getting tired of VR, and we're going to talk about it for, I think, another good 10 years. The other thing is we can no longer talk about story because storytelling is out the window, but why throw out the window story? Story we've been doing since forever is the first relationship you have with your parents. I just think story is here to stay, so let's focus on story and maybe not the technology. Right. Storytelling and story? Yeah. Do I tell you the story? Do you experience a story? And that was the debate for 2 years now. No more storytelling. People are fed up about storytelling. You're not a storyteller. Okay, good, but what does your mom do? So there's kind of this questioning about sharing this other world of ours, not the factual one always. Sometimes it is, but that inner imaginative world, we need to find a way to share it. And when a new medium comes along and we can actually use this medium to share it, I'm all for it.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Right on the dot, 11 o'clock. Thank you very... Sorry?
Yeah. Can you just mention the panel that's coming up next?
Sorry?
The panel that's coming up next.
Oh, the panel that's coming up next. I don't even know what that is. Okay, but thank you very much for to everyone here, for you guys, for participating. And let's give these guys a big hand. Guys.